I will be presenting today or this afternoon on monitoring and evaluation in the agriculture sector. And there will be two main areas, monitoring and evaluation, and then I will look at the national monitoring and evaluation on agriculture. Specifically in this module, what we'll be looking at is the importance of monitoring and evaluation, assessing the effectiveness of adaptation measures, and then we'll explore the selection and tracking of indicators for adequate monitoring and evaluation in a way that adheres to the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. All right, so monitoring and evaluation in agriculture can provide important information on precipitation, soil temperature, soil quality, and crop yields. In terms of monitoring and evaluation, it is crucial as adaptation efforts in agriculture rely on effective monitoring and evaluation to track progress and to ensure objectives are met. Essentially, the monitoring and evaluation facilitates identification of areas of urgent needs for adaptation. It's crucial for implementing sustainable agriculture strategies in response to climate change. Continuous monitoring evaluation through M&E enables prompt decision making based on reliable data. So if changes need to be made, if there are issues, you can address it immediately and not later down when it might be too late. The components of the monitoring and evaluation go beyond the indicators. It encompasses archiving, improving the plans, verification, and reporting to enhance transparency. So when we think about the key indicators and the data collection methods, there are four things we need to think about. Sector-specific indicators for the monitoring adaptation measures in agriculture. So we think about monitoring crop diversity, crop yield, water use efficiencies, and measures approved for adaptation. Technologies would include GIS, remote sensing, weather stations are vital for data collection on climate, soil quality, and crop yields. We also look at qualitative methods, we know like interviews, surveys, and we're going to use them in conjunction with quantitative data so that we have a holistic or comprehensive understanding of adaptation. And then we think about farmer participation. They are an important part of the data collection process. We want to leverage their knowledge for accurate monitoring and effective adaptation in agriculture. So we think about smart indicators. When we think about the indicators that measure performance and tracking of the progress towards the goals, we want to make sure that they are smart. Most of us are familiar with it. So we want them to be well-defined, clear, so to be specific and unambiguous. We want them to be measurable. So we're going to have what are we working towards? It's going to be attainable. So we do not want to suggest an indicator that is impossible for us to achieve. Relevant. We think about within reach, it's realistic, it's relevant. And then time-bound. It's a clearly defined timeline. If there's a starting point, what's the target date that we're going to look at? So the table provides an example of an indicator, of two indicators, and we think about crop yield variability. So specific, so define the specific aspect. What types of crops are we looking at? The regions that we're looking. If it's measurable in terms of quantifying the metrics, so it's tons per acres, it's achievable. So we're using existing agricultural data. We're going to get complete surveys so that we could use to collect the data. It's relevant. It's directly related to food security, productivity. It reflects the long-term agricultural productivity. And then it's time-bound. Annual measurement reports can be established. So are we collecting the data annually? When are we collecting it? What are the timelines associated with it? And then the second one in terms of soil health, similar items. You're identifying the parameters. What units are you using to measure it? How is it achievable? So it's through soil sampling and other testing methods. Relevant, if it reflects the long-term agricultural productivity, and then the time period that you're looking at. So these are the items you want to think about when we're developing the indicators. once the indicators meet these criteria, it means we're trying to guarantee that we're going to have effective monitoring and evaluation so that we could achieve the long-term goals. So in terms of the second aspect under this module, we're looking at national monitoring and evaluation. And we think about, in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, the structure involves these two areas, the sectoral leads and the data providers. So the sectoral leads would include the cross-cutting leads, so the ministry with responsibility for climate change, so that would be the Ministry of Planning and Development, in conjunction with the EMA, and then specific agriculture sector leads like the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. In terms of the data providers, we think about the CSO, Meteorological Service, priority sectors, international entities, whether it's through UNDP, FAO, the different organizations, policy implementers, different custodians of relevant data sets. So these are the responsible entities that we need to think about as it relates to M&E, and these are the entities within Trinidad and Tobago. All right, so the table here gives an example of one of the indicators that has been used. It shows the adaptation relevance of the different indicators in conjunction with a description of the data, the unit that will be used, and how it's connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. We want, in developing the indicator, we want to be conscious that it's relevant and it's directly related to the impacts on climate change and the adaptation measures they track. So it needs to be directly related. The indicators generally should reflect how agriculture is responding to climate change and how well adaptation measures are being implemented. And it also needs to be sensitive to the context. So thinking about the climate profile, what is the national circumstance that exists. So in this situation, we have the indicator is the estimated cultivated area implementing agricultural practices for climate change adaptation. The relevance, adaptation relevance, is by implementing agricultural practices for climate change adaptation, farmers become better prepared to maintain or even improve their production despite the realized and future impacts of climate change. The type of data would be quantitative, units, hectares, and then the SDG relevance, we have 8 areas it would be relevant for. So continuing with the same example, the indicators must be clear and understandable so that we avoid any unnecessary complexities regarding consistency or interpretation. So insights can be drawn by different stakeholders. So we're thinking about the farmers, researchers, the organizations, whoever has to utilize the data. So that is for this reason, the indicator sheet gives information in terms of what is the unit so that we have consistent data across the board. Generally, so based on what I've shown, the type may be quantitative or qualitative. So we want to have a number of dimensions. We know that quantitative data, we think about quantifiable data, we tend to describe it as a bit more objective, whereas you have the qualitative data, which would be more descriptive. You're expressing narratives, case studies, persons' experiences, which gives more insight into the situation. So you have the options in terms of how it's going to be expressed as the indicator. Then lastly, as it relates to the last column, the SDG relevance, you want to make a connection between the indicator, how its adaptation relevance, and how it's related to the Sustainable Development Goals, and how they can contribute to accomplishing the goals, to contribute to a wider Sustainable Development Framework. We're not doing it in isolation. It's the ideas that's going to contribute to our larger goals and our larger objectives as well. So by showing the connection, we get a holistic picture and approach a holistic perspective of the situation. Right, so I have another example. in terms of an indicator, so accessibility to information and data on climate-sensitive parameters relevant to agriculture. The relevance, the adaptation relevance is as a SID in the Caribbean, agriculture in Trinidad and Tobago is prone to climate change due to the prevalence of hurricanes and the impacts of rising sea levels, which can significantly impact soil conservation. So this indicator evaluates the collection and dissemination of data on various climatic parameters and is particularly important to measure the ability of entities engaged in agriculture in Trinidad and Tobago to adapt to climate change and maintain sufficient agricultural production in light of changing conditions. So the type of data in this indicator would be qualitative. The unit, there's no unit applicable for it, and then it would be relevant to these 3 Sustainable Development Goals. So another 2 examples, proportion of farmers trained on agricultural practices for climate change adaptation, and it's disaggregated by data, right? And then we also have the share of agricultural support policies and management plans addressing climate change. And then we have the adaptation relevance. The type for both of them would be quantitative, and then the unit of measure would be in percentage terms, and then the Sustainable Development Goal relevance, or the different items that are listed there. So whether it's zero hunger, climate action, whatever the options are available. All right, so this one is a bit small. So what we have here is the description of a quantitative indicator. So let me see if I can zoom in. Right, and so we have the, as it relates, the indicator name is the proportion of farmers trained on agricultural practices for climate change adaptation disaggregation by data. And what we have in terms of what would be the information that is needed for the description of the indicator, we think about what is the baseline value, so what year are we looking at, what is the current, then what is the target, and then the accomplished percentage, and then in the reference sheet would include details about the relevance, the associated policy, the measure, so the things that we mentioned before, the type and scope of indicator. So we think about quantitative awareness and capacity building, and I'll go into that a bit later down. If there's an associated subsector, the gender responsiveness, and then some details in terms of the data requirements. So number of men and women farmers trained on agricultural practices for climate change, estimated total number of farmers in Trinidad and Tobago, what would be the potential data sources. So we have the Ministry of Agriculture, Extension Division, Regional Administration North, Cocoa Research Unit, the Agricultural Society, Regional Administrative South. So different options in terms of the data sources. So continuing a bit, what the data collection process would look like. So some information on that item. And frequency of data collection. So the data should be collected at every farmer training for which farmers are trained on agricultural practices, which enable improved adaptation to the impacts of climate change, and then at the estimation, whatever formula. So it would vary depending on, it would vary depending on the indicator that you're looking at. This is a complete item in terms of an indicator of what detail would be provided, and so that persons, whoever is different entities collecting the data, would have consistent in data, and we'll be able to see what is taking place and be able to compare. And then a definition of the different variables that item is provided. There's my mouse. All right, last section. For Trinidad and Tobago, there are 8 key activities for agriculture adaptation, and they are tracked by 4 indicators. So there's a link between the National Adaptation Plan strategies and the indicators. The aggregated indicators were developed to track the progress in implementing agriculture strategies with similar objectives, and the strategies were categorized to facilitate the development of the indicators. So in the table on the far right-hand side, you'll see the categories as it relates to the strategies, and then the aggregated indicators minimize the resources required for monitoring and leverage synergies. So if I right, so we have the different items, the 8 strategies, and then we have the categories that they fall under, and then the aggregated categories for the indicators. Right, so to summarize, when we think about monitoring and evaluation, for adaptation, it requires establishment of a M&E system that is smart, so we need to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely for the indicators. And we went into a bit detail of what that looks like. The indicators are important because they help with monitoring performance, tracking progress towards the goal. Are we achieving the goal? Do we need to make changes? What corrective action should we make? It provides valuable insight in terms of what is taking place and where adjustments might need to occur. We also think about the fact that the indicators can be gender responsive to address gender disparities. Baselines are important because it allows us to set realistic and achievable targets so that we know where we're starting and where it is we want to go. Do we need to improve? Where have we improved? So if you do not have a baseline, you do not know if any changes are taking place. You're able to track your progress, compare values before and after a new adaptation measure is implemented. One of the key functions of the M&E system would be to define the roles and the responsibilities. So we talked about that in terms of who are the sectoral leads and what are the data items. So whether it's the ministry in conjunction with the EMA and other sector leads. And we also think about if you're collecting data from CSO and different entities. And then finally, Trinidad and Tobago's National Adaptation Plan contains strategies and indicators to track these strategies. And we looked at those in the last table, which outlined the 8 strategies and then the aggregated items.